Good evening. As you noticed, this is going to be a different book today. I posted a message on my feed earlier about this book. It is an essay book, American Horrors, Essays on the Modern American Horror Film, edited by Gregory A. Waller. And it is a compilation it was published in 1987, so it's pretty old. And it's a compilation of some of the most important horror films that had come out at the time, essays written about those films and how they were impacted and were impacting our culture. And were impacted by, I guess is what I meant to say there. I want to give people an opportunity to watch these films. They are all 80s films or earlier. Most of these are 70s films. So I'll be posting the name of the next film in the series of essays before I read it, so you don't have to deal with spoilers. And the first one I already announced was Night of the Living Dead. So that's a 1968 film by George A. Romero, and it's easily found. It's public domain, so it's all over YouTube, and you can download it from Internet Archive. And then I will probably limit these essays to 1 or 2 per week. That way I can give people a chance to actually watch the films. So today I just wanted to sit down and read the introduction to this book. This introduction was written by the editor, Gregory A. Waller. The modern horror film is an extraordinarily diverse group of texts that epitomize the tangled workings of American popular culture, which is at once business, art, and purveyor of entertainment and ideology. In its adaptability and capacity for accommodating a range of cultural values and cinematic styles, modern horror is probably equaled among American film genres only by the Western from the late 1940s to the mid-1950s. Today, with the widespread availability of video recorders and cable television, we can all become experts in horror in a way that was practically impossible 10 years ago. One such expert to be is the astronaut in Life Force, 1985, who enters the domain of the space vampires and declares, "This is incredible! I hope you can appreciate the scale of this on the video." A fitting reminder of how much horror loses when it is transferred to the small rectangular television image with its relatively poor resolution and color quality. An immersion in a genre reveals that the contemporary horror film encompasses big-budget, major studio productions like Jaws and Jaws 2, as well as cut-rate, independent regional productions designed for the drive-in and now the home video market, like Humongous, 1981. It includes the cinematically accomplished Don't Look Now, 1973, the technically innovative Wolfen, 1981, and the merely formulaic Mortuary, 1981, Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter, 1984. I'm going to leave the years off here. The unexpected wit and savvy of Piranha, Alligator, Alone in the Dark, and Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, and the ponderous pretentiousness of Exorcist II, The Heretic, The Awakening, and Ghost Story. The unremitting seriousness of The Exorcist, The Hearse, The Hunger, and The Keep, and the black satiric comedy of The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Sisters, Motel Hell, and Strange Invaders. While the box office revenues and the production of horror films seem to have ebbed in 1983-84, the genre has by no means disappeared. In addition to the prime-time television horror of certain episodes of Amazing Stories, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and The Twilight Zone, 1985-86, has seen a steady stream of sequels to, for instance, The Hills Have Eyes, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Poltergeist, Psycho 2, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Alien, as well as several variations on The Little Monsters of Gremlins, Ghoulies, and Troll, more adaptations of Stephen King's fiction, Cat's Eye, Silver Bullet, Maximum Overdrive, latter-day vampire films, Life Force, Transylvania 6-5000, and proof positive of the genre's continued vitality and heterogeneity, The Company of Wolves, The Stuff, and Reanimator. What I refer to as the modern era of the American horror film began in 1968, the year George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead and Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby were released, and perhaps not coincidentally, the year of the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence and the election of Richard M. Nixon as president. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the horror film remained on the whole commercially viable, unlike the Western, for example, and repeatedly proved its affinity for the topical and the novel, and thereby affirmed its place as a type of storytelling particularly apt and relevant to post-1968 America. At the same time, however, the genre became increasingly reflexive and elusive, flaunting its own generic inheritance and its own identity as horror and as film. Thus, as Noel Carroll and others have argued, contemporary horror demands to be seen in the context not only of American life in the 1970s and 1980s, but also of those classic texts that it quotes, parodies, imitates, and remakes. Films like Frankenstein, Dracula, King Kong, Cat People, The Thing, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. These films are horror's collective memory, acknowledged by filmmakers and fans alike. Yet what of modern horror's more immediate precursors in the years before Night of the Living Dead and Rosemary's Baby? The 1960s provided a number of noteworthy horror films, still disturbing oddities like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane and Lady in a Cage, The Haunting with its restrained adult, that is, major studio quasi-Victorian terror, 2000 Maniacs, and Herschel Gordon Lewis's other notoriously violent drive-in movies, and from outside of America, Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, Roman Polanski's Repulsion, Mario Bava's Baroque tales of witchcraft and repression, like Black Sunday, and Masaki Kobayashi's cinematic rendering of Japanese ghost stories, Kwaidan. Most important, the 1960s saw the release of two of the most accomplished American horror films, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho and The Birds, both of which would greatly influence the shape the genre would take in the 1970s and 1980s. The presence of Psycho, for example, haunts innumerable films, from Sisters, Halloween, and Psycho 2, to made-for-television movies like Scream Pretty Peggy, which features an apparently harmless young man who assumes the identity of his dead sister and murders attractive women. And The Birds lies behind Night of the Living Dead and virtually all post-1968 films of apocalyptic horror, as well as films like Day of the Animals, The Swarm, and Savage Harvest. Hitchcock also had his imitators in the 1960s, William Castle and Homicidal, for one, but the decade was dominated by horror films much safer and more formulaic than Psycho and The Birds. Films like American International Pictures' adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe stories and Hammer Studios' series of British-made monster movies that pit humankind against familiar antagonists like Count Dracula, The Mummy, and Frankenstein's creature. In different ways, Hammer and AIP both transformed the horror film into a colorful period piece, usually set in the 19th century, peopled by inspired, grandly theatrical, often middle-aged villains, well-meaning, innocuous young male heroes, and buxom young women waiting to be ravished or rescued. Hammer films like The Reptile, Dracula, Prince of Darkness, and Dracula Has Risen from the Grave place a premium on unobtrusive, nondescript cinematography, stylized performances, Oh, something happened. Am I live? Am I still... Slow connection, it says. The wonders of going live. I have one person in here, I think. Is that you, Kathleen? It's Carlene. I meant Carlene. You can't hear... You can hear me grumble? All right. How about now? Is everything cool? Okay. Well, sorry if you're listening to this after the fact, but I'll go back a little, I guess. Hitchcock also had his imitators in the 1960s, William Castle and Homicidal, for one, but the decade was dominated by horror films much safer and more formulaic than Psycho and the Birds. Yeah, I read this already. Let's see. Let's get down here. Okay. Hammer films like The Reptile, Dracula, Prince of Darkness, and Dracula Has Risen from the Grave place a premium on unobtrusive, nondescript cinematography, stylized performances, special attention to decor and set design as bearers of meaning, and utterly straightforward plotting involving perfectly legible scenes of exposition, confrontation, and resolution that announce the film's system of values. Blending an unambiguous style with easily decoded themes and messages, these films are often small-scale social fables that reveal certain correctable flaws in the 19th century world they depict. For example, The Reptile, a representative Hammer production, pictures the danger to a rural community as emanating from an upper-class manor whose owner, a forbidding and stern doctor of theology, has looked too deeply into the mysteries of the East and so must eventually suffer for his sins, and so much the rest of this community, since the doctor's sins have social consequences. In the film's finale, a fire of purification destroys the manor house, killing both the overreaching scholar and his victimized daughter, who has been transformed by a primitive religious cult into a murderous reptilian monster. Apologies for these spoilers. Sorry about that. They will continue, so be aware. As a result of this sacrificial destruction in the guise of self-defense, the rural world is once again safe from imported evil, and the middle-class newlyweds who are the real targets of the monster can proceed with the all-important task of setting up a household and beginning a family. What virtually all Hammer's horror films of the 1960s, particularly Hammer's extremely popular vampire films, offer the viewer is a world in which religious faith, ritualized violence, and individual heroism defeat a powerful but easily identified threat. Thus, quite unlike Psycho and The Birds, Hammer's films reaffirm what are assumed to be the normal values of heterosexual romance, clearly defined sexual roles, and the middle-class family, and testify to the importance and the relevance of social stability and traditional sources of authority and wisdom. In vastly different ways, Night of the Living Dead and Rosemary's Baby, the two films that could be said to have ushered in the modern era of horror, challenge the moral, social, political assumptions, production values, and narrative strategies of Hammer and AIP films. Though there were zombie-like creatures and satanic cults in the movies before 1968, Romero and Polanski redefined the monstrous, thereby redefining the role of the hero and the victim as well, and situate horror in the everyday world of contemporary America. The essays in this volume by R.H.W. Dillard and Virginia Wright Rexman explore in detail the moral and psychological implications of this process of redefinition in Night of the Living Dead and Rosemary's Baby. Looking backward, we can now see how these two innovative, much imitated, commercially and critically successful films helped to map out certain directions the American horror film would take in the 1970s and 1980s. I think this may contain some spoilers, but I'm thinking they're probably minor. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, independently produced on a budget of $114,000 in the wilds of Pennsylvania, is a graphically violent and darkly ironic treatment of catastrophic yet fully natural horror. In its images of invasion and social breakdown, it follows in the tradition of The Birds and Don Siegel's 1956 Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And like later films such as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, It's Alive, Carrie, and The Hills Have Eyes, Night of the Living Dead offers a thoroughgoing critique of American institutions and values. It depicts the failure of the nuclear family, the private home, the teenage couple, and the resourceful individual hero, and it reveals the flaws inherent in the media, local and federal government agencies, and the entire mechanism of civil defense. Romero's first feature is also a prototype of the low-budget, money-making horror film produced outside the established industry. Following Night of the Living Dead come, on the one hand, cut-rate, utterly derivative exploitation films, including most of the so-called teeny kill or slice-and-dice movies released in the wake of Halloween and Friday the 13th. And, on the other hand, idiosyncratic independent productions like the films of David Cronenberg, Michael Laughlin, and Larry Cohen, imaginative, disturbing, often outrageous films like Rabid, Strange Behavior, and Q, the Winged Serpent. In contrast to Night of the Living Dead, Polanski's Rosemary's Baby was produced and distributed by a major Hollywood studio and adapted from a best-selling novel. Rosemary's Baby, we might say, gave birth to highly professional, much publicized, mainstream, and so somehow acceptable and authorized horror films like The Exorcist, The Omen, and Poltergeist. Rosemary's Baby also has a different lineage than Night of the Living Dead, for it has ties to previous films about female madness, conspiratorial evil, and sexual repression, including certain of Val Lewton's atmospheric productions of the 1940s, like Cat People. If Night of the Living Dead draws upon age-old fears associated with invasion and the end of the world, and on what Sigmund Freud calls out fear of the dead as malevolent enemy, Rosemary's Baby brings up to date the theme of humankind's weakness and complicity with supernatural, satanic evil. Furthermore, like countless subsequent makers of horror films, Polanski takes as his focal point an apparently defenseless young woman. With Rosemary, we discover the terror that lurks in the heart of the familiar, the evil in the mundane and the banal. Rosemary's Baby tells us of an isolated, justifiably paranoid woman who attempts to become independent from traditional, which is to say male, paternalistic, socially validated, sources of protection and strength. From Rosemary's Baby to Demon Seed, Eyes of Laura Mars, Alien, and Visiting Hours, horror films have proven to be among the most significant documents in America's public debate over the status of the independent woman in a society still dominated by men. If 1968 could be said to inaugurate the modern era of horror, it is not simply because this year saw the release of Night of the Living Dead and Rosemary's Baby. More important, in 1968, the Motion Picture Association of America, MPAA, instituted its Industry Code of Self-Regulation as a response to, and an attempt to sidestep, public concern over the role of censorship in the media. From the late 1960s into the 1980s, the MPAA's Code and Rating Administration, CARA, has grappled with the status of the horror film, refusing to grant an R rating to Romero's Dawn of the Dead in 1979, for example, and making a concerted effort in the early 1980s, to restrain the tendency toward graphic violence in films like Halloween 2. With few exceptions, the modern horror film has been an R-rated genre, and the MPAA R rating has allowed for and perhaps even legitimized the presentation of explicit violence. The violence of decapitation and dismemberment, of needles to the eyeball, and of scissors, kitchen appliances, hand tools, and shish kebab skewers that as deadly weapons. Such violence, undertaken with an air of top that, ingenuity, and lovingly explicit detail, is perhaps the single defining characteristics of gore movies like Maniac, It is equally important to note that the R rating also allows these and all other horror films much more freedom than pre-1968 films in the explicit treatment of sex, nudity, profanity, and what are euphemistically called adult themes like incest, necrophilia, rape, and cannibalism. By continually pressing the boundaries of both PG and R ratings, the modern horror film has violated taboos with a monster-like ferocity, unprecedented in the contemporary American cinema, and in the process, horror has increased freedom of expression and affected the codes of commercial television as well as the motion picture industry. Without Night of the Living Dead and The Exorcist, we would have had to wait much longer for made-for-television movies to bring child pornography and nuclear holocaust into our homes during primetime viewing hours. Excuse me. There are any number of valuable and critically defensible generalizations to be drawn about the horror film, including, for example, James B. Twitchell's distinction between terror and horror. The etiology of horror is always in dreams, while the basis of terror is in actuality. Robin Wood's definition of the horror film as collective nightmare in which normality is threatened by the monster, and Dennis Giles's contention that central to the strategy of horror is delayed, blocked, or partial vision. Yet, given the diversity of the genre since 1968, it is impossible, I think, to define once and for all the essence of modern horror, or, for that matter, of the Hollywood musical, the post-World War II Western, or the hard-boiled detective story. Nonetheless, there is no question that violence is a major element in the genre, as it is in virtually all dreams and all narratives of fact or fiction that we would label as horror stories. The motion picture industry's often predictable advertising campaigns for horror movies entice with the promise of escalating body counts and elevators filled with blood, the same blood and gore that led the genre's many detractors to deem horror dismissible or damn it as dangerous. Like the characters on screen, the viewer cannot ignore the violence in these films, which is linked, as Philip Brophy argues, to a graphic sense of physicality and body horror. How then should we face up to, or master, or make sense of modern horror's violence? Although it is essential to acknowledge the role of the individual viewer and the collective audience as elements of and in the filmic text, studies of the quantifiable behavioral effects of violence on the movie or television viewer seem to me to be beside the point. What horror films offer, after all, is the representation of violence. Violence embedded in a generic, narrative, fictional, often stylized, and oddly playful context. Only by ignoring the precise terms of the context and the codes and conventions of representation and of perception can we categorically group, say, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Omen, The Burning, Scanners, and Slumber Party Massacre together as interchangeable exercises in dehumanizing ultraviolence. Rather than validating our safe oversimplifications about horror, genre films, and popular culture in general, these and other horror films insist on offering and at times unsettling and interrogating us with what Stephen Neal calls the conjunction of images of violence with images and definitions of the monstrous. What is most significant psychologically and ideologically is the precise way each horror film displays this conjunction and speaks about the nature and function of aggression and conflict. Taken as a whole, the entire genre is an unsystematic, unresolved exploration of violence in virtually all its forms and guises. Thus, recent horror films return again and again to questions concerning the meaning of self-defense, vengeance, and justified violence, to myths of uncommon masculine valor and all too common female victimization, and to images of violation, sacrifice, ritual, and of life reduced to a struggle for survival. This much maligned genre undoubtedly has its share of forgettable demonstrations of the fine art of murder, like Happy Birthday to Me and The Prowler. But it also includes films like George A. Romero's Martin and Dawn of the Dead, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and David Cronenberg's Videodrome, which are among the most noteworthy recent examinations of the role and representation of violence in American culture. One common response to the violence in modern horror is to praise or damn the genre simply on the basis of its preoccupation with state-of-the-art makeup and special effects work. Fanzines like Cinefantastique and Fangoria are given over almost exclusively to articles and interviews that focus on production information and special effects. More telling is the contention, voiced by Chicago movie reviewers Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel, among others, that modern horror has become what Morris Dickstein calls a reductive, hardcore pornography of violence made possible by the virtual elimination of censorship. The equation of explicitly violent horror with pornographic gore is often based on the assumption that truly effective horror is always indirect and suggestive, leaving the horrific primarily to the viewer's imagination. This assumption informs histories of the genre like Ivan Butler's Horror in the Cinema and Carlos Clarence's An Illustrated History of the Horror Film, as well as S.S. Prar's 1980 study Caligari's Children, the Film as Tale of Terror. These critics follow H.P. Lovecraft's distinction in supernatural horror in literature between the true weird tale, which offers a certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces, and the story that is merely mundanely gruesome. The prescriptive call for films of suggestive horror, and implicitly for films that valorize an unseeable, transcendent signifier, is generally linked with a nostalgic longing for the golden age of horror, from Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, and Vampire, to Universal's politically and socially conservative classics of the 1930s and 1940s. A reviewing of Frankenstein and King Kong, however, reveals that these films quite clearly rely on images of explicit violence, as close to gore as was possible in 1930s Hollywood. This approach to the genre unjustly serves the past as well as the present. We would do better, I think, to pay attention to films like 1979's Dracula, An American Werewolf in London, The Funhouse, and Reanimator, which in modernizing and commenting on classic monster movies prove that the relationship between contemporary and Golden Age horror involves much more than simply the distinction between the graphically direct and the atmospherically suggestive. Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1978 and The Thing from 1982 perform a similar function for 1950s horror. The most important criticism of modern horror's so-called pornography of violence is directed more explicitly toward ideological rather than stylistic questions. For example, what are we to make of the genre's propensity for depicting sexually active teenagers and independent women as victims and for suggesting that the male monster is something of a superego figure reaffirming through vicious murder the mechanics of repression so necessary for a patriarchal society? Seen in this light, certain horror films, stupid, gory, sexist rip-offs, Bruce Cowan calls them, could be read as being of a piece with X-rated pornographic displays of rape and other male fantasies of sadism and exploitation. The question of how we are to assess the horror film's representation of violence against women is further complicated because the genre includes texts like The Velvet Vampire, Friday the 13th, and The Hunger that picture the threat to normality as a female or that offer a narrative in which the besieged female victim is alone capable of destroying her psychopathic assailant. Through her independent actions, the woman in Eyes of a Stranger and Visiting Hours, and in Alien and Aliens as well, proves her capacity for self-reliance and self-defense, but has she simply switched roles in the ongoing patriarchal drama? Several essays in this collection make clear the important cultural and sexual issues at stake, in the horror film's choice of victims and elaborate on the complex issues involved in the genre's representation of violence and against women. Examining modern horror in terms of what I have called its exploration of violence is but one, albeit important, way of defining lines of continuity and areas of emphasis within the varied field of modern horror. We can, for example, construct a typology of the monstrous. After all, without the disequilibrium caused by the monster, there is no story to be told. No doubt it is true, as Rudolf Arnheim declared in 1949, that the monster has become a portrait of ourselves and the kind of life we have chosen to lead, and that, in Frank McConnell's words, each era chooses the monster it deserves and projects. There is, however, no simple formula that can explain the many shapes the monster takes in recent horror. Not all monsters are embodiments of our repressed fears and sexual desires, or personifications of social ills or adolescent anxieties. Yet certain distinctions should be drawn between, for instance, the monster as willfully, irredeemably evil, The Exorcist, Halloween, Damien, Omen 2, and Christine, the monster as somehow beyond or beneath good and evil, Carrie, It Lives Again, of unknown origin. Overlapping these categories is the distinction between the singular threat, Count Dracula, the shark in Jaws, the extraterrestrial being in Alien, the psychopathic killer in Friday the 13th, and the multiple threat, Romero's Living Dead, the Manson family in Helter Skelter, the ghostly Avengers in The Fog, the werewolf colony in The Howling, and the corporate Machiavels in The Stuff. While it would run the risk of reducing the horror film to a wax museum or catalog of creatures, a fully developed typology of monsters would offer a valuable means of delineating the paradigmatic possibilities open to this genre and the sort of fears that it feels will suitably trouble its audience. Furthermore, since modern horror, like virtually all popular art, tends to run in sequels and cycles and sets of texts, call this the principle of exploitation or imitation or safe investment strategy, a necessary critical task is to chart the course of specific cycles of subgenres or formulae. Charles Derry offers a good starting point for this project when he divides horror of the 1960s through the 1980s into three categories, which he dubs the horror of personality, of demonic evil, and of Armageddon. Elsewhere, I have taken a somewhat narrower approach by examining the interaction between convention and innovation in the many vampire novels and films of the 1970s, as has Vera Dica in her analysis of the cycle of stalker films from Halloween to Hell Night. To write the history of modern horror, we would need to place the stalker film and the modern vampire story in the context of other overlapping cycles and subgenres, including, for instance, films that come in the wake of Frogs and Jaws, which pit humankind against a threat from the natural world, stories of hauntings, the Amityville Horror, Poltergeist, and Possession, The Possession of Joel Delaney, Ruby, Amityville 2, The Possession, ecological nightmares like Prophecy and Humanoids from the Deep, and films of visionaries and dreamers from Deadly Dream to The Sender and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Since such subgenres find expression in novels as well as movies, one unquestionably important context for the contemporary horror film is mass-market horror fiction of the 1970s and 1980s. From Rosemary's Baby and The Other to the spate of adaptations of Stephen King's novels in 1983, The Dead Zone, Cujo, Christine, and 1984, Firestarter, Children of the Corn. The major studios have approached horror principally as a matter of adapting bestsellers for the screen. The countless paperback novelizations of films are of no intrinsic interest, though they surely attest to the popularity of horror in the 1970s and 1980s and to the interdependence of the entertainment industries. Like horror fiction, the made-for-television horror movie also provides important corollary and counterpoint to films released since the late 1960s, both because filmmakers like Steven Spielberg, John Carpenter, Wes Craven, and Tobe Hooper have all directed telefilms, and also, as I suggest in my essay in this collection, because horror takes a vastly different shape when it is tailored for primetime network television. In addition, subliterary comic books and, in the 1980s, sub-cinematic rock music videos have served as host for as well as a parasite of horror films. Paying due attention to the subgenres paying due attention to the subgenres and cycles within the horror film and to the intermedia relationships within larger field of horror underscores the variety and adaptability as well as the continuity of modern horror. When we place horror within the broader continuum of popular culture, which is in a perpetual state of realignment and renovation, ideologically as well as formally, the boundaries of demarcating this genre become hazy at best. Spurred by the demands of the marketplace, the interests of the audience, the cultural and political climate, and the contribution of the individual artist, popular genres intermingle, influence each other, and evolve through a cumulative process of repetition and variation. One result of this process is a film like Mommy Dearest, a blend of family melodrama, investigative expose, and old-fashioned biopic that derives a good deal of its imagery and its thematic preoccupations from the horror film. Or we consider the case of Prom Night and Terror Train, which were unambiguously advertised as horror movies in the manner of Halloween and Friday the 13th. Though they do feature psychopathic killers, both of these stalker films are structured very much like classical whodunits, complete with a plethora of mysterious clues and a cast of likely suspects. Prom Night and Terror Train, in turn, have their analogues in the many recent detective films, including Sharky's Machine, I, the Jury, Endangered Species, and Tightrope, which match the detective against a monstrous opponent who seems to be an interloper from the realm of horror. As Leo Braudy puts it, understanding the appeal of horror films these days is crucial to understanding films in general because the motifs and themes of the horror film have so permeated films of quite different sorts. Finally, to situate horror in the context of contemporary popular culture, we have to take into account not only questions of adaptation, imitation, and permeation, but also the relationship between horror and the other popular movie genres of the 1970s and 1980s. For example, the rise of the modern horror film should be seen in relation to the decline of the disaster story and the early 1980s reemergence of the story of nuclear war, both of which, like horror, dramatize a sense of vulnerability and the capacity for survival. And the many horror films that picture teenagers as survivors and monsters, but preeminently as victims, find their doubles in Porky's and other R-rated comedies of sexual misadventures and adolescent hijinks. So too, the highly traditional dream of heroic valor and selfless sacrifice in a universe of absolute values and transcendent forces, a dream embodied in Star Wars, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and any number of fantasy adventure films and space operas, is answered and undercut in different ways by the many horror films like It's Alive and Dawn of the Dead that refuse to present us with situations in which moral, political, and spiritual distinctions are perfectly clear. And as Vivian Sobchak so effectively proves, the many horror films since Rosemary's Baby that focus on the child and the family are best read as companion pieces to family melodramas like Ordinary People and science fiction films from Close Encounters of the Third Kind to Starman. Taking the horror film as our guide, we can and should begin to rethink the nature of influence and imitation and the meaning of genre and formula in contemporary popular culture. In so doing, we will inevitably rethink our own understanding of horror as well. Beginning appropriately enough with studies of Night of the Living Dead and Rosemary's Baby, the essays in this book reveal a good deal about the range and the significance of modern horror. These are by no means the only worthwhile considerations of the genre published in the past 15 years. See the annotated bibliography for an overview of criticisms about the genre written since 1968. And there are films, Alien, The Shining, directors, Cohen and Craven, and issues, the aesthetics of the sequel, the transformation of the genre between 1968 and 78, that merit more than the passing glances they receive in this collection. Much remains to be written, for horror poses questions and triggers anxieties that demand a response, intellectually as well as emotionally. Having attracted the attention of critics and general audiences alike, individual films such as The Exorcist and Halloween, and the larger evolving text that is the horror film will, I think, continue to teach us about the narrative art of the movies, the processes of popular culture, the workings of the motion picture industry, and the peculiar pleasures we seek from entertainment. While modern horror can be understood as but the latest manifestation of broad-based post-romantic archetypes and psychosexual myths, Twitchell in Dreadful Pleasures makes the best case for such a reading, it is at least equally important to keep in mind that the horror film has engaged in a sort of extended dramatization of, in response to, the major public events and newsworthy topics in American history since 1968. Fluctuations in key economic indicators and attempts to redirect domestic and foreign policy, Watergate and the slow withdrawal from Vietnam, oil shortages and the Iranian hostage crisis, the rise of the new right and the moral majority, and the continuing debate over abortion, military spending, and women's rights. Further, contemporary horror can and has been interpreted as an index to and commentary on what have often been identified as the more general cultural conditions of our age, its crisis of bourgeois patriarchy, to borrow Sobchak's phrase, its narcissism, postmodernism, and sense of the apocalyptic, and its attitude towards technology, death, and childhood. As much as any branch of contemporary popular art, modern horror mirrors our changing fashions and tastes, our shifting fears and aspirations, and our sense of what constitutes the prime moral, social, and political problems facing us individually and collectively. But mirrors is too limited a concept, for just as horror can run the gamut from the reactionary to the radical, so it can alternately underscore, challenge, oversimplify, cloud, and explain the facts, styles, and contradictions of American culture. If nothing else, this genre is ambitious, not least of all because, in Cowan's words, horror films represent a unique juncture of personal, social, and mythic structure. Horror defines and redefines, clarifies and obscures the relationship between the human and the monstrous, the normal and the aberrant, the sane and the mad, the natural and the supernatural, the conscious and the unconscious, the daydream and the nightmare, the civilized and the primitive, slippery categories and tenuous oppositions indeed, but the very oppositions and categories that are so essential to our sense of life. That's the end of the introduction. The first essay that I will be reading is Night of the Living Dead. It's not just, let me try that again. Night of the Living Dead, it's not like just a wind that's passing through, by R.H.W. Dillard. So, if you haven't seen Night of the Living Dead, now's your time to do it. Watch it, and I'll be back maybe in a couple days and read that. Everybody have a good evening.